want to quickly go over the concept of a differential diagnosis and what it is. So, first of all, let's remember that in Western medicine, what we are doing nowadays is what is called evidence-based medicine. All right, evidence-based medicine is supposed to be based on science, misspelling that, scientific method, and on evidence, okay? Now, having said that, with a differential diagnosis, there is an element of art involved, because this is the medical arts, okay? There is a big dose of critical thinking involved, okay? And how well differential diagnosis as a practice goes kind of depends on the clinician and how much training they've had in the scientific method, how familiar they are with a differential diagnosis, how much time they have for working it out, and so forth. But basically, the idea is that you are doing a systematic technique where you're taking a lot of unknown information and you're trying to narrow down possible causes for whatever disease process that you've got going on, okay? Sometimes there is one major sign or symptom. All right, so for example, let's look at a really nice fracture of the radius that is displaced. Man, you do an x-ray of that, everybody knows you've got a displaced radial fracture, and they know exactly what to do, okay? Sometimes it's not so clear-cut. So say someone falls and they've got bruising, maybe a little bit. The signs and symptoms are consistent with a fracture, but when you do an x-ray, there is no image on the x-ray that shows that a fracture has occurred. Now you're starting to get into a little bit more of a complicated situation where you have to do more critical thinking, and hopefully you've got someone who's good, who's going to be like, yeah, fractures sometimes when they're small don't show up on x-rays the first day. We're going to put you in this sling and stabilize it so that you don't make it worse, put you in a nice brace, come back in a week and let's x-ray it again. And sometimes that doesn't happen, okay? Now those are kind of fairly simple examples. So let's think about when we've got multiple signs and symptoms. We're dealing with something that's a little bit more complicated. I mean, it might be really complicated, like something like lupus or MS, or it might be something that's a little bit simpler. Kind of depends. But basically, with the process of creating, my handwriting, a differential diagnosis, kind of like the first step is going to make a list of symptoms. Okay, symptoms, signs, whatever, okay? Then you're going to take that list, and then the next step is going to make a list of possibilities. And this list should be pretty broad, okay? So you're going to start, obviously, with the most obvious. That was kind of redundant. So the most obvious causes. But then you're going to also include the things that are less likely as well, okay? And this is important because sometimes our signs and symptoms are not consistent. Sometimes you've got unique reactions or you've got bizarre interactions between comorbidities. So, for example, if you're looking at something like bleeding disorders, you might not just go to the top two. You might try to include 4 or 5 things in your list of possibilities, even if you're pretty sure number 3 and 4 are long shots. Because with that differential diagnosis, you want to be inclusive and then rule out, okay? So the next step is the rule out phase, okay? And you rule out things by doing more tests, A lot of times it's lab tests. Other things can be involved as well. But basically, you collect more data, all right? And then the idea is that these lab tests help cross off the less likely candidates for the diagnosis. That does not mean, all right, may not be true, okay? Sometimes you can get lab results and you cross something out, and then 5 years later, you're like, oh, yeah, this was just kind of like a borderline case. So let's take someone who has hypothyroidism, and they've had it for 20 years, and they've been tested for hypothyroidism every year of their life for the last 20 years, and they keep getting a negative diagnosis for hypothyroidism. And then one day, somebody is like, let's just try them on some levothyroxine and see what happens. And all of a sudden, all of their symptoms go away. So this person had hypothyroidism, but it was borderline. So even though their lab results were not within the classic ranges to confirm hypothyroidism, they still had hypothyroidism and they still responded to the treatment, okay? So sometimes the rule out phase is wrong, okay? And then what you're going to do is you're going to treat. And often what happens is they take the most likely. So they've gone through and they ruled out the least likely things. They take the most likely and they start testing interventions, treatments. All right, so you're going to start doing interventions, treatments. And you're going to start with the things that cause the least amount of damage. We don't go to, say, surgery as their first choice of treatment. We do change in behaviors or maybe a mild medication instead of a medication whose side effect is to cause cancer, like methotrexate. All right, so it helps to kind of guide this process. And again, this is where the art comes in and critical thinking. And this is a tricky process, okay? I'm sure everyone's got family members or people they know in their community where they've been sick for 5-10 years and nobody really knows what's wrong. And they've tried all kinds of things. And it's really frustrating and they're still sick. And 10 years later, they're like, oh, you have fibromyalgia. Sorry. Here, let's try these things instead. Or maybe they got diagnosed with fibromyalgia in year 3, and then 6 years later, they get diagnosed with hypothyroidism. I'm just going back to that one. And then all of a sudden, once they're treated for the hypothyroidism, all their symptoms of fibromyalgia go away. Okay? So it's kind of a tricky process. So on this next slide, what I'm going to do is kind of show you some examples of differential diagnoses. So let's kind of look at that next. All right. So if you spend some time in the medical library over at UNM or anywhere, what you'll find is if you go in, you'll find a lot of books. And in some of those books, medical practitioners have come up with classic differential diagnoses. So a woman goes into the doctor suspects that she has PCOS, which is polycystic ovarian syndrome. In order for it to be diagnosed, because PCOS is a syndrome, it doesn't have a clear-cut sign or symptom like a depressed level of thyroid hormone or a fracture. Those are very specific. A syndrome has a lot of different things going on, and different people have a different range of symptoms and signs. Okay, so if you go into the medical literature, you will see that they have gotten together and done a lot of arguing and written a lot of papers that help them get more money at their various hospitals or universities, and they've come up with what they call the differential diagnosis for PCOS. And basically what they will do is they will take the list of symptoms, okay, and then they will come up, what are the things that get confused with PCOS? So this is the differential diagnosis. So you've got PCOS, but first we need to rule out pregnancy, hypothyroidism, hyperprolactinemia, blah, late onset CAS, ovarian tumor, blah, 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 blah. And these are the laboratory tests that they're going to order to let them start ruling out these things. Once they have ruled out these things, they can be like, this is likely PCOS. And so we're going to treat it that way and see what happens. Okay, and it lets them guide what kind of treatments or interventions they're going to suggest. All right, let's look at another example. All right, so here's an example of one that I've pulled from the British Medical Journal on differential diagnosis for type 2 diabetes in children. Okay, so you've got these various conditions: glucose intolerance, type 1, monogenetic diabetes, atypical diabetes. Okay, so in this table, you can see no differentiating symptoms, which means it's difficult to distinguish it. So over here, these are the tests that they're going to order in order to try and tease out whether it is this or this. Same thing over here. So what things give you a clue on distinguishing whether it's type 1 or type 2? All right, so these are the things that are kind of a clue, but they're not really diagnostic. So then you're going to order these tests and use this to try to tease out whether it's type 2 or type 1. And whether it's type 2 or type 1 is going to help guide what treatment plan is used, okay? And sometimes it's really frustrating, like there are no differentiating tests, all right? Only clue that you really got is that you might be negative for diabetes-specific autoantibodies, okay? Same thing over here. So it can be really tricky. And sometimes they pick one because they think it's the most likely, and again, they treat it, they don't respond to treatment. They're like, maybe it was the other thing over here, and maybe we need to treat this. And then if they respond, then they're like, okay, well, guess what? You have type 1 and not type 2. Okay? All right, so this is an art form, and this is full of critical thinking, and I think it's really fun and cool to do on our case studies, which is why I really kind of focus on this concept in a lot of the written case studies. Okay? All right, so that's the end of this little mini video on this topic.